What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Rustomod. We are back on the 1966 Chevy C60. And in the last few episodes, we have really knocked out a bunch of stuff on this project. Last time you saw it, we actually put some new suspension on here and some new wheels and tires. We cleaned up the engine bay and we're trying to get this thing ready to go to get back on the road. But if you guys missed the last few episodes, I'll give you a quick rundown of what we've done to this truck. So, in the beginning, we actually started with a 1966 Chevy C60 dump truck that had been off the road for a long time. The truck needed a ton of work, so what we decided to do was I took a cheap Silverado, I yanked the cab off of the C60, yanked the cab off of the Silverado, put that classic C60 cab on top of that Silverado chassis, and we made body mounts, we got a new radiator in there, we got our bumper mounted, we got new suspension, new wheels and tires, and this thing is really coming along. It looks really cool, but there is a lot of stuff to go to try to get this thing back on the road. So my goal for this truck is to try to tackle everything we can before we try to tackle the wiring harness, because that's going to be the one big time-consuming thing that we have to knock out. I really want to try to clean up the interior. We still have to figure out what we're going to do for our transmission tunnel, and we have some rust issues we have to tackle, and we still have the original gas tank that's still in there. So I want to try to get all that stuff cleaned up on the inside. But before we clean this truck up, I want to tackle a few more things that might make a little bit of a mess. All right, well, our wheels and tires are looking really good, and I want to go on that path and try to clean up the engine bay and try to make this look really good. So if you guys remember, we have a radiator stuck in here, and we were trying to figure out what we're going to do. If you can see, the water pump is really close to the electric fan. I think I'm just going to run it for now. If we have to change it, the one thing I'm going to do is change the water pump to a electric style water pump where it doesn't have the thread on the end of it. But we can do that anytime, not really worried about that. But we only have two upper radiator brackets because we didn't have anywhere to mount it on the bottom. So while I had the front end pulled off, I actually added some rib nuts down here so we can add some lower radiator mount brackets. So I'm going to yank the radiator out real quick. We can make those bottom brackets and the radiator should be in there for good. And then I want to start tackling our radiator hoses. All right, so I already cut the upper radiator support bracket out of this piece of sheet metal. If you guys remember, this piece worked out perfectly because the holes actually lined up perfectly with the core support and the new radiator. So I'm going to cut two more of these brackets out, and then we can go ahead, pull that radiator out and see how it fits. All right, well, those radiator brackets worked out really well. So we got the bottom ones down in there. And you can see before I put the front clip back on, I put some rib nuts in here. So that lines up right with our bottom radiator mount. So this thing is finally sturdy and it shouldn't be going anywhere. So now I want to try to work on the upper radiator hose because I got some stuff for that and I want to see if it'll work. This is kind of my hoarding parts for the C60 table. And I have some radiator hoses here. So this is the stock radiator hose that came on the truck. And I went ahead and I just bought an aftermarket one. I bought these because these are probably pretty old, so might as well just get a new one. And I got the lower one as well. But we're probably not going to be able to use this shape in the C60. If you can see, the radiator actually is obviously really close to the motor. And we're trying to connect from this size to the bigger size on the radiator. So I went on Amazon and I found these two adapters. I've used these before on the Buick, and I believe I actually used one on the Rambler to be able to adapt the bigger size hose on the radiator to the smaller hose on the engine. The upper radiator hose on the LS is pretty small. So this is the correct size I'm going to need for that radiator. and I need to adapt it down to this smaller size on the engine. So what I'm going to do is take these radiator hoses. I'm probably not even going to use this exact layout that the truck originally had, but at least this hose has a bunch of different bends in it, and I can try to map out where I want it to go to finally put that adapter in on the radiator side. So I'm going to try to map out the top hose. It's very tight to be able to get up to there. So we're going to try to have some adapters, maybe try to get some hose to be able to make that work as well. But I'm going to knock out the top real quick. That way that's out of the way. And then I can focus down there on the bottom. See if I need to order anything to make that work. All right, well, I got the upper radiator hose in there. Not a big fan of it, honestly, guys. I don't really like the splice in there, but it's the only thing that I could find to go that short of distance and then go from that size to that size. But might just have to deal with it. If I find something in the future, I'll definitely upgrade it, but it'll work for now. The other thing I did was I went ahead and pulled off the throttle body. So this truck originally was drive-by-wire, and I talked to a bunch of guys, and most people said they didn't really like the drive-by-wire stuff. I've never done a drive-by-wire before. Mainly everything that I've done here is drive-by-cable. So I went ahead and I had the old Buick intake, luckily, and I took the throttle body and swapped it to the drive-by-cable style throttle bodies. So hopefully that'll work a little bit better with the ECU that we're going to be putting in this thing. So I have all the original wiring harness and stuff here, so I'm actually going to pull all that stuff off, and you guys will see what we're going to run for an ECU in a future episode when we do all the wiring. But just so you know, we're using the drive-by cable, probably be a little bit more reliable. All right, so now that we got that upper radiator hose, I'm going to tackle the lower radiator hose and see if we can make that work. It's a little bit tighter, but I think I can make it work with what I have. All right, well, it was a little tight, but that lower radiator hose is down on there. So we got the radiator hoses knocked out. This is kind of my plan. I bought a universal kind of Silverado intake for this, and the intake on the Silverado actually goes onto the passenger side because it's going to hit that alternator right there, and it's kind of going to be in the way of the radiator and a bunch of other stuff. So that goes over here, but the original battery went right here, and I kind of want to keep the wiring very similar to what it was on the original truck, but unfortunately, I'm just not going to have enough room. So I'm going to try to move the battery and all that stuff over to here. So I bought a universal battery box, so I'm going to try to put that in on this side, but I'm going to need to pull out all this original stuff. But I want to try to keep the horn and everything, so maybe I can move this stuff over to the other side and still use it. But all this other stuff I'm not going to need anymore. I'm probably going to just redo it because we're going to do the entire wiring harness on the truck. So I'm going to start by pulling all this out. All right, well, we got our battery tray right there put together, and what I'm going to do is it does stick up a little bit on this side, so I might just lop that corner off. We'll see if it interferes with anything, but what I'm probably going to do is drill some holes in this back plate and then just bolt that straight to this core support here. Probably use some rib nuts in there, that way I don't have to pull this off if I ever want to remove it, but that is the plan. All right, well, you can see we got the rib nuts in there and our battery tray is mounted. So pretty good. I was a little nervous that this was going to hit the hood, but I just shut the hood and everything clears really well. So that's in there. We can hook up our battery terminals and everything else that we have to do. But the main reason I put it over there was because our intake is going on this side. So let's put that on and see how the whole engine bay looks complete. All right, well, that worked out pretty good. This is just a cheapo Amazon Silverado intake. It came with a bunch of brackets and stuff. Not gonna really be able to use any of that stuff, but it actually worked really well in the C60. So have our air filter here, and we have our battery mounted here. We got our battery cables and everything ready to go. So that is pretty much it on the engine bay. The only thing I have to do is hook up the throttle cable, and I have a little bit more work to do on the brake booster, just tightening some stuff up, and we have to hook up the heater core, but it's getting really close, guys. I'm excited. I think this is turning out really clean, really nice, and it should be as stock as you can get, so I'm pretty happy with it. All right, so the interior is a little bit of a mess. So I'm gonna try to clean all this stuff out of here. It still has the original gas tank behind the seat. I wanna try to pull all that stuff out. If you guys don't know, this truck actually came from the original owner. In the very first episode, I went over everything. But this was the original temporary tag that was on the truck. Unfortunately, it broke, but I wanna try to keep that. And then it came with all the dealership information and service records and stuff. And it also came with the glove box. Usually has an identification tag on it, and they stuck it on the owner's manual for some reason, and it's still on there, so you can kind of see all the specs and stuff on the original truck. Pretty cool to have all that stuff, so I want to save that as much as I can. We'll get all this pulled out and clean it up a little bit. So I've been tinkering away with a bunch of little stuff because I'm trying to get this thing ready to go so we can bring it to the big shop and I can yank the cab up and then finish our cab mounts. I'll show you guys on the lift what I'm talking about when I get to the big shop because they are pretty rotted and I want to just tackle it, and I might as well just use the 2-post lift to make my life a little bit easier to try to do the cab mounts. After we do the cab mounts, we can put everything back together. I have a shifter and a few other things I need to put in, and then we can start the wiring. So I want to try to knock out this wiring harness at the big shop. I have everything there to do it. It's just a lot easier than doing it in here. I live an hour away from the big shop, so coming back and forth from my house to do that would just make my life a little bit easier to just bring the truck there. So hopefully we can get this thing wired up, and once it's wired, we should be able to start it for the first time. So I'm really excited about that, but we got to knock out a few more things. So let's get to the shop. All right, well, we're back in the big shop and I got the C60 on the lift. But the first thing that I'm going to have to do is lift the cab up. So this is a little bit tricky because I do have the front clip back on it. It's only held on with a few bolts. So I think the easiest thing to do would probably be just to pull this front clip back off and then just lift the cab individually. But I think it's going to be a little bit more tricky than that because I have this side step here and the step actually bolts to the cab mounts that we're going to be welding in. So I can't lift off that. So I might have to lift off the roof or something, kind of like we did when we first pulled the cab off the frame. Maybe that would work. I'm not really sure. I got to figure out a way to lift this thing because from the bottom, I don't think is going to work. All right, so got the front end pulled off real quick, and then I just undid the cab mounts real quick. So the way that we're gonna try to lift this is we wrap these around that door plate, ratchet strapped it on all 4 corners the same way. So hopefully we should be able to just lift it up like this. I don't need to go super high, just need to come off of where it's mounted to the frame. All right, so you can kind of see why I wanted to pull this cab off, and you can also see why I've been putting it off for so long. So this is the bottom
place for the cab mounts. It's a support that runs across, and underneath of it is pretty rotted. So I'm gonna have to cut this out and then weld in the new one. Actually bolts here on the sides, which I'm sure those will come right out real easy. So the other thing I need is on the other side, that bottom step actually bolts to this. So I'm gonna have to try to get those bolts out and then make a support or something to reattach this step on the other side, because that's gonna have all your weight on it whenever you step into the chassis. So I'm going to try to clean all this stuff up, get this thing cut off here, and then try to weld in the new ones. All right, so you can kind of see how bad this is underneath here. There is that hole in the floor. We talked about that before, so I'm going to have to patch this all up with some sheet metal, but I'm going to cut this cab support out of there, and then it actually isn't rotted all the way back. It looks like it's pretty good shape, probably from here over. So I have this new one, and that's gonna go in place of that. And then the actual fender mount bolts to this. So that all came off, but I've been just grinding this thing, trying to get all this undercoating off here so I can actually weld to it, and it's really thick. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut this out of here, and then we have a fresh start of what we're going to do with the rest of this floor. All right, well, I got this side step removed and I got this side cut out. This is definitely a lot of work, a little bit more rusted than I was thinking it was gonna be, but we gotta just try to get it back together. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna try to make some plates and stuff for this stuff that I didn't realize was rusted, try to box that in, clean it up as best as I can to keep it from rusting even more. And then we'll go and cut our new sheet metal cab supports and weld those in. The other reason I wanted to pull the cab off is so I can finish welding the cab mounts. I didn't do that because I couldn't get to them with the cab on there, so I can tackle those now as well. Probably should have ordered some aftermarket sheet metal, and this would have made my life a lot easier, but I didn't do that. I just went ahead and found some sheet metal that I cut at the sizes that I need to be able to patch the holes that I had cut out of the cab. So hopefully I can get this stuff tacked in there, and then I can get the other side done. Try to just weld this thing back together, and then once we get that in there, I'm gonna lower the cab back down. Alright guys, well, a lot of work later. Both the cab mounts are tacked into place, so we can finally let the cab down. And then I took off the side step, which is kind of nice, so now I can lift it up a little bit higher by putting the lift underneath the cab. Lift it up all the way, drag this frame out of here, and then I can finish doing the floor and everything on the lift, and I can actually get underneath it a lot easier. So that's what I'm gonna do now, but we're making some progress. This is definitely a lot of work. So we got those bottom pieces tacked into place. So now I got to start working on the floor and patching these big holes in there. So I'm going to start by just cutting out all the rust, getting it to a shape where I can make a patch panel, and then just basically connecting the dots and trying to get some floor pans in here, and then we can spot weld it to that cross member that we put in. I got this cut out, basically the shape that I want. So now I'm gonna just trace this onto a piece of sheet metal and then cut it out of sheet metal and then try to form it into the floor here. All right, guys, well, after a ton of work, the cab is officially done. So we got those two cab mounts welded into place. We have the floor patched, and then I even went around and all the little rust spots cut out on each side and patched those. We have seam seal on that, so hopefully no water could get back into the cab and then rust this thing even more. And then I went ahead and painted it with some chassis paint, and it should be good to go. Now you might be wondering why at the beginning of the video did I spend time on putting everything in the truck just to take it all back apart. Well, I wanted to get all that stuff done first, because that way whenever we pull the truck apart, we get the cab ready to go back onto the frame. It'll be that much quicker to get this thing completed and put completely back together. That way we can start the wiring, because the wiring is probably going to take some time because we want to do this thing right. So we are going to tackle all that stuff on the next episode. Hopefully we can get this thing all wired up and at least put completely back together. So you're not going to want to miss the next few episodes. Make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe so you can stay up to date with all the episodes we have here on Rustomod, and hopefully we can get the C60 back on the road. See you guys then.